Can the SG-1000 punch above its weight class? Let's find out in episode 11 of Segaiden. As we move further into 1984, SG-1000 developers are beginning to demonstrate a better understanding of what makes the hardware tick. To be honest, what came out for the system throughout 1983 paled in comparison to a lot of the best games that were already available for the nearly identical ColecoVision hardware. Now that developers are up to speed with the system and we're into the second generation of software, however, we'll see games that both look and play a lot better than what's come before. It's enough to make you wish Coleco had been able to stick it out through the American crash. Imagine how great ColecoVision games of 1984 and 85 could have been. This episode, we have a rare instance of a game that appeared on SG-1000 alongside its Famicom version, Lode Runner. In fact, it's entirely possible that Broderbund's computer hit Lode Runner showed up on both Famicom and SG-1000 at retail right around the same time. And as such, these two games give us a great opportunity to really gauge what both of these platforms were actually about. Lode Runner, of course, as we've very recently seen, began life as an Apple II puzzle platformer, a trap-em-up classic in which players controlled a small man in a maze of bricks and ladders attempting to gather up as much gold as possible while evading a fleet of indestructible guardians. Despite its proximity and release to Donkey Kong, your avatar here lacked the ability to jump, a daringly unfashionable design choice for 1983. Instead, your verbs consist of running, climbing, and digging. Most of the action consists of running and climbing and gathering gold and evading guardians, which are depicted on the box of this version as robots. Digging plays an essential role in navigating the brick mazes as well. Many gold ingots can only be collected by drilling a hole in the floor and dropping down to the lower level to grab them. Jumping down a makeshift pit can also give players a quick, though not necessarily foolproof, escape from the robots. At the same time, digging takes advantage of some of the fundamental differences between the player and his tormentors. In the base game, your protagonist moves more quickly than the enemy robots, even for actions that would logically be dictated by universal forces, such as falling. The most critical difference, however, comes down to how you interact with pits. For the player, empty spaces created with the drill amounts to empty air. Hop into a hole, fall until you hit ground. For robots, however, those gaps work as pits, a single contained space into which they'd fall and become momentarily stuck. A trapped robot only remains stuck in a pit for a few seconds, but those few seconds can give players all the time they need to get out of a tight spot. Pits eventually repair themselves, growing back into solid ground. Time it right, and you can take a robot out of the action by causing the pit to reform over its head, destroying it. Not that such hijinks amount to an instant win. Dark droids don't die, they simply reform at the top of the screen. But nevertheless, it's a handy technique to master. In this very simple sandbox of rules and mechanics, creator Doug Smith built one of the most relentless puzzle games of the era. Simultaneously fast-paced, yet incredibly cerebral, it became an instant hit and was quickly licensed for release on both SG-1000 by Sega and Famicom by Hudson. As we've seen on NES works, Hudson approached Lode Runner with the same liberal hand as they did the Famicom version of their own PC puzzler, Nuts and Milk, giving Lode Runner a massive visual overhaul to bring it more into line with the standard look and feel of Nintendo's platform. On the other hand, Sega, or rather developer Compile, working under Sega's supervision, took the high-fidelity approach. Lode Runner on SG-1000 looks remarkably similar to the Apple II game, with simple stick figures running through a maze constructed of tall, narrow blocks. It's much less cute than Hudson's version, and much less slow, where the Famicom port reduces the speed of the action to help account for the need to scroll the action across multiple screens, another massive change from the Apple II game. Compile actually juiced up the action slightly. Lode Runner on SG-1000 runs a little faster and a little more smoothly than the original computer rendition, making a frantic experience that much more taxing. But it's incredibly faithful, at least within the limits of the hardware. As with the Famicom port, the SG-1000 cartridge format couldn't contain all 150 levels of the Apple II original. Where Hudson trimmed their release down to a paltry 50 stages, Compile managed to squeeze 80 into their game, the downside being the loss of the level editor. And of course, at least one of those levels ended up being redesigned for SG-1000, not for technical reasons, but for the sake of branding. The level originally designed to resemble the Broderbund logo on PC now spelled out the Sega logo instead. But these are ultimately minor differences. Pitted head-to-head against the Hudson conversion, Lode Runner on SG-1000 really showcases the differing nature of the two systems. Nintendo was cute, friendly, and approachable. Sega was fast, unforgiving, and true to the source. It would seem Japan's console audience was more about the cute and friendly, since Lode Runner for Famicom went on to become the inflection point from which the franchise grew into even greater popularity in Japan than in its native region. Sega's version, on the other hand, has almost entirely been forgotten. Our next game combines two of Sega's favorite things, safaris and racing. It's Safari Race. Now, to my knowledge, this game has nothing to do with maze action game Safari Hunting or Master System light gun game Safari Hunt.
If anything, it's closer in nature to Sega Rally Championship. That could even put you in control of a Lancia Stratos, an iconic Italian car that rose to prominence after dominating a number of international races throughout the mid-70s. That car is worth a mention because this is the most elaborate and detailed sprite we've seen to this point on SG-1000. Sega's console could famously only generate single-color sprites, giving it a built-in visual disadvantage to Nintendo's Famicom and its three-color sprite objects. We've seen a few two-color player sprites in a handful of games to this point, such as Sinbad Mystery, but those graphics seemingly broke the rules by just combining two different sprites into a single object. Safari Race takes this to another level, sandwiching who knows how many individual sprites to create a car featuring no less than 5 different colors: white, black, red, green, and blue. And the blue is just there as a grace note, a little detailed that could just as easily have been rendered with black. Clearly, this is Sega's programmers showing off, as if the forward behind the car viewpoint wasn't enough of a flourish. We've seen this racing perspective on SG-1000 at the second phase of each leg of Zippy Race's endurance run, but it's executed in a much more convincing way here. In a way, this appears to be Sega's answer to Zippy Race. Rather than drive across the US on a motorcycle, however, here you need to cross the African savanna in a sports car. But as in Zippy Race, fuel is the ultimate determinant of your efforts. Run out of gas, and you run out of game. Rather than simply cruise over gas cans scattered on the road in order to refuel, however, you instead need to stop at actual pumps that appear by the roadside. This is the strangest and most vexing part of Safari Race. It's not enough to simply pass by the pumps, you need to stop precisely next to them in order to register a refill. And your car doesn't drive in reverse, so biff your approach and there are no retries, making for a practically guaranteed game over. Also, as in Zippy Race, the road is full of hazards that seem to have it in for you. For the most part though, these are not hyper-aggressive drivers. You'll see other cars on the road, much less impressive looking than your own, but they're fairly easy to dodge. Instead, the real danger comes from the safari element of the game. This being the savanna, you'll spot all manner of critters from gazelles to elephants, and all of them make a beeline directly for your car, dashing across the highway at the perfect angle for you to smash into. It wouldn't do to lose your pricey auto in a fiery collision, or for that matter to smash into endangered wildlife at 200 kilometers per hour, so obviously you want to avoid barreling into the beasts at all costs. This is not the most amazing racer of all time, but again it further establishes Sega's cred as the purveyors of authentic arcade action, or as authentic as you were going to get with this tech anyway.
If you thought the car in Safari Race looked impressive, glom your peepers on this. Champion Boxing, by far the most impressive looking SG-1000 game to date, featuring 2 huge animated boxers facing off against one another in a ring surrounded by animated faces.
Now I can't speak to the tech here. I don't know if the boxers simply consist of a whole bunch of sprites stacked on top of one another, or if the boxers are actually just drawn as part of the background. I do know, however, that Champion Boxing does not look like the sort of thing this system should be able to handle. Fittingly, Champion Boxing appears to mark the debut of 2 developers who would go on to become Sega legends: programmer Yu Suzuki and designer Rieko Kodama. I say appears because Kodama has admitted in interviews that she can't remember 100% which game she first worked on for Sega, so this may not be her first. But it's certainly the most Kodama-ish. Champion Boxing features 2 boxers, a tall, lean blonde who would almost definitely be an Ivan Drago homage if not for the fact that Rocky IV was still a year away, and a shorter, pudgier guy with dark hair. The latter looks a lot like Alex Kidd, the mascot character Kodama would design a couple of years later. In any case, these pugilists are detailed and colorful enough to hold their own against the outlaws of Nintendo's Wild Gunman. The difference being that you don't passively watch these boxers shuffle onto the screen and draw arms, but rather control them yourself. Or at least one of them anyway. Admittedly, Champion Boxing does not play as impressively as it looks. The control scheme owes a tremendous debt to Technos' Tag Team Wrestling, which had debuted in arcades in 1983 before making its way to Famicom and NES a few years later. There's only so much this hardware could do, and no doubt the elaborate visuals further restricted the action. So rather than taking the form of a fast-paced test of reflexes and improvisation, Champion Boxing instead plays as a sort of kludgy menu-based work, where you choose commands before spamming them in desperation. Straight, jab, uppercut. You cycle through these commands by tapping button 2 on the controller, then lay into your rival with the selected action by hammering button 1. There's not a whole lot more to it, unfortunately, just to cycle through a handful of menu commands, try to move into attack without taking a counter punch to the face, and hope you win. But even if it's not an all-time classic of the genre, there is a lot to be said for the impression it made in 1984.
We can assume it went over reasonably well since this was one of the 5 games that Sega reissued in the MyCard format once the Mark III launched in 1985.
A home console boxing game with graphics this detailed and elaborate? The only other boxing game with fighters rendered as something besides stick figures available for home systems at the time was Rocky's Super Action Boxing for ColecoVision. That obviously wasn't even the merest hint of a blip on the radar for consumers in Japan who didn't have access to Coleco consoles and probably wouldn't have cared anyway. Certainly it looks a step or two above anything else on SG-1000, even if the gameplay is a bit mundane. This really does feel like the embarkation point for a new era of SG-1000 software, all the way down to the debut of a new cover illustrator whose chunky, cartoonish style is a dead ringer for Susumu Matsushita. Matsushita is best known as the illustrator for games like Maximo and Adventure Island, and as the cover artist for Weekly Famitsu magazine, a gig he took up in 1986, shortly after the sun set on SG-1000 and Sega moved along to a new house style for its cover art. There's no record online of Matsushita having painted SG-1000 cover art, so it could just be a case of this uncredited illustrator having a very Matsushita-looking style. Whoever created it, though, it's a heck of a cover, further building on Exciting Boxing's legacy of visual excellence.
And finally this episode, yes, it's another Champion Series sports game. It's Champion Soccer, a game of soccer for champions.
Yeah, that's right, soccer, even in its European releases. I suppose Sega was leaving open the possibility of an NFL-style Champion football that thankfully never came to pass. Champion Soccer doesn't look as impressive as Champion Boxing, but that's probably to be expected given the very different nature of the sports in question. Here the hardware has to keep up with two teams of 5 players plus a pair of goalies, a ball, a cursor, and a constant scroll of motion up and down the field. And despite that, Sega still seems to have managed to fill the screen with multicolored characters, with black hair, eyes, shoes, and trousers, flesh-toned skin for a certain value of flesh tone, and distinct jersey colors. The game does suffer from some strange graphical artifacts as a result. The characters are surrounded by empty boxes that cause field markings or even other players to vanish when they overlap. It's hard to be too critical though, because Champion Soccer absolutely demolishes any other home soccer sim I can find from 1984 or earlier. Unlike the Champion games of 1983, which felt like the last dinosaurs of a dying era before the meteor called Famicom struck, Champion Soccer plays more like a latter-day game. In addition to fielding 2 full teams, Champion Soccer also makes use of an arrow icon to indicate which on-screen player is under the real-world player's control, rather than simply giving you control of a team moving in absolute unison the way, say, Pele Soccer for Atari 2600 did. It even adds a scaling effect to the ball when it's kicked, simulating its rising altitude and nearness to the virtual camera, a trick Nintendo employed in its Famicom sports games and which works equally well here. In fact, more so than any other Champion title we've seen so far, Champion Soccer can stand toe-to-toe with the Famicom's subsequent take on the same sport. Turn the fielding sideways so the screen scrolls horizontally rather than vertically, and you basically have Nintendo Soccer, which would ship for Famicom in April 1985. Nintendo's game would move more smoothly and feature slightly larger character sprites, sure, but unlike with something like Famicom Golf and Champion Golf, the difference between these two games isn't some insurmountable generational gulf. Champion Soccer is a little shaky on the tech front, but in terms of game design, it feels like Sega forging the way into the future of the genre rather than bringing up the rear. And yeah, the Matsushita-looking box art is great.
Next time on Segaiden, Sega wraps up 1984 by completing its 1980s Dream Team.